This evening we're going to continue in our creation evangelism, and that is, how do we really approach people? How can we effectively reach a secularized, humanistic culture? Now, not everyone is an atheist, but we are becoming more and more secularized. And if you are out engaged in meeting people and trying to minister to people, you know the challenge. You're finding more and more people that you encounter do not know the Lord, have not been to church, grew up in families that know nothing about religion except what they hear on TV or someone is talking about at school. And we are faced with a great challenge. In Psalm chapter 50 and verse 6, it says, "And the heavens shall declare his righteousness, for God is judge himself." Of course, that goes along with a number of other passages, such as Romans chapter 1, in which it says, "Even the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, of the truth in unrighteousness." It's a very interesting development of thoughts in Romans chapter 1, but we are, as humanity, we do have a knowledge of God. Now, we become blinded, and we can come to a point, well, I don't know God. If he'd only show himself, I would believe. I was debating a philosophy professor, and there was a podium there that we were sharing on either side of the podium or the stage. He'd come up and then I'd come up. And he said, if God really exists, if he just makes this podium rise up and float around in the room, I would believe. I said, no, you wouldn't. You'd be looking for the strings. You'd be looking for, there's got to be something to explain this. Even if he couldn't find the reason, he knows there had to be some natural reason for that. People's minds are already made up, aren't they? And that's why when we ultimately are sharing the gospel and ministering to people, it's not about us. We, as Paul said, we don't come with the power of persuasion, human wisdom. That's not how people are changed. Ultimately, God has to poke on our hearts. And that's what we talked about Sunday. When God gives us a measure of faith, when he starts poking on our hearts, he is revealing to us, I'm talking to you. But he uses us, he calls us, and he says, I want you to go and share your testimony, share the message of my son Jesus Christ. And so we're tagging along with the Holy Spirit. As the Holy Spirit is engaged out in the world, convicting men of sin, righteousness, and judgment, and we are engaged in a ministry along with the Holy Spirit, and we are clarifying, we're answering questions, and most importantly, we're supposed to be demonstrating the power of God to make change. And so as the Holy Spirit is poking on people's hearts, they're looking at us and we're saying, hey, I was changed, look at me. And that's the power of our testimony. Not because there's power in us or power in our change or anything we did, but it's a testimony of the power of God. Now, we do want to be effective in our ministry, and so last night we were completing our intelligent design approach. That is, we were making a case for there's got to be a supernatural out there. And yes, there's a lot more examples, from the mosquito to the giraffe. And the incubator bird, and all kinds of fascinating examples. When you start looking into God's creation, you begin to realize there's just no way that this just popped into existence by accident. It just doesn't make sense. So we covered those points last night, and there's a summary of things that we talked about, Brother Jeremy. We have complex non-random design of DNA molecule, complex design and function of organs, symmetry of body designs, complex design behavior, irreducible complexity, and fine-tuning. And what we need to do, need to go around and ask folks to tell you about that. See, we need the practice, don't we? We need the practice. All right. We're going to move into another arena. We're into origin of the universe. But one of the things that we want to do is size people up. I had several conversations the last couple of days about the importance of knowing where to begin. How do you know where to begin when you're talking to people? It's like Jesus when he met the woman at the well. He wasn't talking about the laws of thermodynamics, but he started right where she was. And that dictated, hey, this is our beginning point, and I'm going to bring her to Christ. I told the story about meeting an electrical engineer, and we started out with where he was, and then we got to the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was talking to I was reminded this evening in talking to Brother Larry about a grad student in literature. Now, literature, those folks are hard to reach because they are steeped and indoctrinated in being very subjective. And it's whatever you want it to mean. I'll tell you an interesting story about that. When I was at Irvine, our English professor was telling a story how they brought in a poet to the faculty, and he was giving a guest speaker lecture, and they had luncheon with him, and all the professors were sitting around the table and talk about, oh, the way you foreshadowed those ideas, and oh, that was such a wonderful development of thoughts, and the way you constructed that. And he said it was so funny because the poet said, wow, I didn't know I did all that. Well, that's part of the training in the arts of the fine arts, and especially in literature. You interpret. It's very subjective. So I find that's a very difficult crowd of people to meet, to talk to. And talking about connecting with people where they are, I met this guy. He invited us in. We were talking, and it was obvious we're not getting anywhere sharing the gospel, because it means whatever you want it to mean. He had his opinions too. So I was praying about, well, Lord, what can I do to make headway here? Aha, I know. So I asked him if he would mind evaluating the gospel of Jesus Christ as it's presented in the Bible, and let me know if he found it consistent and if it makes sense. And he said, sure. And he sat there and listened very carefully to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And when I got done, he said, he gave an evaluation and concluded that makes a lot of sense. It's consistent. I don't see any problem with that. And so there he got to hear the gospel. Now, it's up to the Holy Spirit to do the rest. But that's what we're supposed to do, right? We just share the message. All right, let's talk about the laws of thermodynamics and ultimately the origin of the universe. That'll be our first point. We have 3 points we're going to cover: the origin of the universe, origin of life, origin of species. And I also like to make the point that this is probably the most important thing I say this week, is right there, what you're seeing on the board. I'll give you a story to illustrate that. I was engaged in a debate for 2.5 years with a number of professors from the university, one a dendrochronologist, an engineer, an amateur anthropologist who is a medical doctor in radiology in the neighboring town, and there were a couple of other folks and teachers there. And Dr. Cherry was, we were friends. He said, anytime you're teaching on creation science, I want to be there. Not because he agreed, because he didn't agree. But he wanted to hear what I had to say. It fascinated him, and he was looking, he was searching. And 2 years into our debate, we met every other month, and I would give them my material that I'm going to talk about the next month, and they would have time to look at it, and then we'd meet and talk about it. So what I'm sharing with you, by the way, it has been put through the fire. This stuff works. And I use that to prepare myself for debates at universities or talking to people. So it works. But I had presented the case of thermodynamics that we're going to talk about tonight. And he got up and he said, well, first of all, the laws of thermodynamics only apply to closed systems, and living organisms are open. I said, well, wait, Dr. Cherry. I'm not talking about species or animals, open systems. You're correct. They are open systems. I'm talking about the origin of the universe. And so we went back and forth for clarification, and then he put the chalk down and said, I agree with you. Now, two things come out of this. Number one, it's important to listen and hear what's really being said. He was struggling with listening. He thought he already understood what I was saying, but that's part of the blindness, is when we are talking to people, we have to be listening to them and finding out if they are understanding what we're trying to say. And that only comes by interacting and asking questions and taking it slow enough in our conversations. The second thing is that when we are talking to people, even though they may disagree, they're not necessarily hostile. Dr. Cherry was not hostile. He was not being belligerent, and I've come across plenty of those people. But he really wanted to know. And I was simply presenting arguments. I got him to agree on the first 2 points, origin of the universe, origin of life. Now, it's very important to keep these separate, and that's why I say it's the most important thing you'll hear about, because most of the time when you listen to a debate between a creationist and an evolutionist, or you read books and materials, they get this all scrambled, and that's what confuses people. That's why a lot of times it's hard to follow, because they're not keeping it separate in these 3 categories. 3 separate categories, 3 separate sets of questions with 3 different sets of evidences. And if you can keep it straight, man, you're going to make some real headway. So this evening, we're going to deal with the origin of the universe. And there are 2 main laws of science that we want to deal with here, and that is the first law of thermodynamics and the second law of thermodynamics. How many have heard of those laws? Yep. And how many can explain them? Well, nobody's willing to. Well, I know some of you can. Now, in the first law of thermodynamics here, we'll start out. First law of thermodynamics is known by a number of things, descriptions. It's known as the conservation law, the law of conservation of matter, of energy. It speaks that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It's an empirically derived law. That means it's been physically determined in the physical laboratory, tested and weighed and measured in every way you can physically. That's all that means. Now, this is a law of science, and I dealt with that last night. A law of science is, as of today, irrefutable. And there's no reason to think that it's going to be any different. Well, that's very interesting, because everything in the universe is made of energy. Why, this is energy right here. Your body is energy, the earth is energy, the sun is energy, the light here, the sound and the warmth, all of that are different forms of energy. We can release the energy out of wood. For example, here in the podium, we can light it on fire, raise the activation energy sufficient, and the bonds will break, and then it's going to start releasing the potential energy that's in here. It's going to be releasing energy from the bonds, the chemical bonds in the wood. It'll release it in the form of heat or sound or light. And those are your primary forms of energy. Matter, E equals mc squared, shows you that there's a relationship between energy and matter. And light. Wow. So this was a nice little equation. I'm sure most of you recognize that. How many kids recognize that? Yeah, isn't that interesting? Everything in the universe is made of energy. Now, here's a question to ask ourselves. If everything in the universe is energy, and energy cannot create itself naturally, then it must have got here supernaturally. Because the law says it didn't come by natural means. Well, the creation science model is supported by the evidence. Now, what is the significance of that? Remember last night I talked about the laws. And you go from hypothesis to theory to law. And when you have a law of science, even a theory or hypothesis, is not legitimate if it contradicts a law. Well, there's no contradiction here. The creation science model is in perfect conformity to this law. Evolution, on the other hand, here's what they propose. They propose that that nothing blew up and produced everything, which is a contradiction in itself. But notice, you can see how obvious the Big Bang starts at one point and progresses over time and organizes itself. I mean, the evidence is right there before your eyes. They drew it out there for you to show you how obvious it is. But you know, how many times have you seen pictures of or videos of bombs blowing up? Have you ever seen organization come out of an explosion? Never. It never happens in the lab. It never happens in the real world. It's always just the opposite. It's pure chaos. It goes from organization to disorganization is what we have. And yet we're supposed to believe that nothing blew up and expanded and formed all that material naturally. But wait, if that's their proposal, there's a serious problem, because that contradicts a known irrefutable law of science that says energy can't form itself. And by the way, something from nothing, I had to put this quote here because some people say, no, surely no one would say that. Yeah, someone would. Imagine no space at all and no matter at all. To the average person, it might seem, to the average person, now are you average? To the average person, it might seem obvious that nothing can happen in nothing. You have to be average to think that way. You have to be abnormal to think otherwise. Yeah, abnormal. But to a quantum physicist, nothing is in fact something. Now, I know what they mean, but I'm not going to clarify it. They say that to mislead people. They don't explain what they mean. And I told this story the other day. A particle physicist told me, I called him up on the phone and was asking him about his claim that something can come out of nothing, the laboratory evidence. And he said, oh, yeah, that was the whole vacuum experiment from the 1940s and 1960s. I said, well, Dr. Harder, I'm familiar with that experiment. That was not something coming out of nothing. And he's going, well, we're on the phone. He's going, well, yeah. That was just the change of one form of energy into another form. The energy was already there. Oh, well, yeah, well. All right, so I'm not going to elaborate on that. They're abnormal to say that. You have to be an ordinary person to think that something can't come out of nothing. All right, evolution actually contradicts a law of science is what it comes down to. And when you have a model that proposes an explanation that contradicts a law, you have clearly a model of science, and we won't even call it a model of science. It's a contradiction, isn't it? It's not scientific. And so the models of evolution for a natural origin of energy are unscientific. There's nothing scientific about them. And you say, but wait, it's taught in the science classroom. The first law of thermodynamics is. And yes, evolution is also taught that in the physics department, but we now know, and all you have to do is raise your hand in class. If you ever get to class and you talk to someone and say, doesn't that idea that something can come out of nothing, doesn't that contradict the first law of thermodynamics? All you have to do is raise the question. And as I mentioned yesterday, Dr. Spiegel got one of my students in his classroom, and she raised that question. He said, Well, I'm not prepared to answer that question. Yeah. And when he said he would come back Wednesday and I'll tell you what the answer is, all he did was define what science was and say, religion has no business in the science classroom, we're not going to talk about it. That's not an answer. That's an excuse. That's an escape. He's running away from it. All right, so as far as evolution is concerned, it's just completely unscientific. By the way, I might point out we've got, there's some rebuttals, and that's what I'm going to deal with next. The rebuttal to that is, well, energy didn't have to create itself because it's always been here. Now, that sounds, okay, we can say, all right, it may not sound all that reasonable, but if they bring it up, we have to address it. Well, second law of thermodynamics is on our side. And why is that so important? Because it's irrefutable evidence right now. Laws are meant to be broken, right? Yeah, but it hasn't been broken yet. And as of today, there's no reason to think that it will be broken. And so it's an irrefutable source of evidence that supports the idea that energy cannot create itself by natural means. But if energy's always been here, we got the second law of thermodynamics, also known as the law of entropy. And when we're talking about the law of entropy, the evolutionists still have a problem because the law of entropy is everything is winding down, running down. It would be like having a clock and it's tick, 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 tock. Everything comes to an end and unwinds, doesn't it? And so when we look at the second law of thermodynamics, everything as it's running down is ultimately going from order to disorder, from order to chaos. There's a loss of usable energy. All that energy that went into a clock to wind it up, it's unwinding. Where does all that energy end up? It's being converted into heat energy. And the heat energy floats out into the room as heat and then out the window and out into outer space, never to be used again. And that's why I say it's unusable energy now. Now, the second law of thermodynamics works this way. Water always runs downhill. Have you ever seen a waterfall go up? Nope, it doesn't work that way because of entropy. In fact, have you ever seen eggs put themselves back together? That's because of the law of entropy. That's how, it's very practical. Have you ever seen a house on fire pull itself back together? Of course not. Why? That's the second law of thermodynamics. It is so fixed as far as a law, it actually becomes what they call the arrow of time. The reason for that is, and that ultimately everything dies, even the universe is said to be dying, it's going to reach the end point of what is called heat death, because heat is the final and end point of all energy, heat. That's your maximum randomized chaos of energy. Now, by the way, this prevents the time machine. Yeah, you can't go back into the past, because if you could go in the past, then the eggs have to put themselves back together. Water has to be able to run uphill. Houses need to come out of the smoke in the air. Everything has to put itself back together. Entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, prevents even the reversal of time. So it's considered the arrow of time. So here we have the entropy here, keeps us going on one track, and that is winding down, winding down. Clocks don't wind themselves up. If I had a clock here, someone said, well, you know, that clock you had up there was a solar clock. Yeah. Well, that means that it's getting its energy, isn't it? From the sun, from light. And that's letting it run. But if you turn the light off, what happens? It stops, because you cut off the energy. See, the only way a clock can keep running is you got to keep putting energy into it. Same way with your body. What happens if you stop putting energy into your body? You stop breathing, you stop eating. What happens? You're going to die. You have to supply your body with fuel, just like you do with your car. The car won't run anymore if you run out of gas. So now some of you have been to, Brother Sergeant, have you been to Prague? You seen the Olomouc? Oh, yeah, you recognize that clock then. And in fact, that's where I got that picture. I took it. And it's a famous clock, but that clock represents gears. You got a giant clock, and that is actually representing the solar system. That's what that clock was based on. Well, the entire universe is operating like a bunch of gears inside of a clock. The Earth is orbiting the sun, and the planets are orbiting the sun, and the moon is orbiting the Earth, and galaxies are forming with all the planets and stars surrounding a big black hole, and then you got galaxies surrounding and spinning around one another. It's like one gigantic clock, and the universe is slowly winding down. The sun is burning out. The stars are burning out. That's all entropy. All right, so the point here is that there is an end point. And it's unwinding, and that end point is very important because here's a couple questions we can ask. If the universe has an end point, must have had a beginning point. So what is the significance of that? Yeah. You got to have a beginning. It couldn't have always been here. It had to have a beginning. You see, we're answering that question, well, energy didn't have to create itself and have a beginning point because it's always been here. But wait, if it's winding down, that means someone had to come and wind it up in order for it to wind down. It can't just start. It had to have a starting point. That means if it has an end point, got a beginning point. And we know from the second law of thermodynamics, it can't wind itself up naturally. If it can't wind itself up naturally and it's wound up, it had to happen supernaturally. If the universe is unwinding, who wound it up in the first place? It had to be supernatural. Now, those are two nice little arguments right there. They're laws of science. They're irrefutable. You can't lose the debate there. It doesn't mean people are going to say, cry uncle and say, you win, I agree. It doesn't mean that, but you can't lose the argument. Because anyone who argues against the creation science position of a supernatural creation and winding up of the universe are arguing against two laws of science. And you don't want to be on that side. The creation model is supported. Remember those four criteria of a good scientific model? It has to be supported by scientific data and should not be contradicting data. Creation science model has it hands down. Evolution, on the other hand, is proposing only natural explanations and therefore contradicting known laws of science. And evolution's proposing that everything comes out of an explosion. Nothing exploded and produced everything, all this organized energy in the universe. So evolution's concept of the Big Bang looks organized only in the pictures. Concerning the second law of thermodynamics, the only explanation that really has any legitimacy as far as being scientific is the creation science explanation, not evolution. Now, Arthur Eddington had an interesting quote. He said, if your theory is found to be against the second law of thermodynamics, I can give you no hope. There's nothing for it but to collapse in deepest humiliation. Gordon Van Wylen wrote and said, the question that arises is how the universe got into the state of reduced entropy. Remember, entropy is chaos and disorder, right? So when he talked about reduced entropy, we're talking about increased organization. Someone wound the clock up. So reduced entropy in the first place, since all natural processes known to us tend to increase in entropy. The author has found that the second law of thermodynamics tends to increase conviction that there is a creator. Very interesting. All right, now, if we were to take a survey right now, do you feel confident that you could share a couple of thoughts here about the laws of thermodynamics? Because after all, that's what we're doing, and it's pretty simple, huh? Let's just do a brief review. The first law of thermodynamics says what? Nothing can be created or destroyed by natural means. Okay, in other words, it can't create itself. That's the point, by natural means. If it can't happen naturally, then it must have happened supernaturally. And the significance of that is it's a law of science, which as of today means it is irrefutable. That's right. And credible scientific explanations do not contradict known laws of science. So we have to ask ourselves, well, how is it possible then that they call it science? They call evolution science, the Big Bang science. Well, that's the danger of monopolizing ideology in academia and in science. It's all based on a presupposition or an assumption of naturalism. All your explanations, regardless of how rational they sound or how contradictory they are preferred over a supernatural explanation. All right, now that brings us to our second category, and you say, wait, are we done with the first, origin of the universe? How many arguments do you need? One of the first things I noticed when I got into studying the Bible and reading books, I noticed that there was a common fallacy, and that was the more arguments you can think of, you win, no matter how stupid the argument is. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. All you need is one good argument, and that settles it. That's what you want. You want quality, not quantity. And if you go for quality, then it gets even simpler. You got two laws. And so if someone comes and says, hey, energy's always been here, what do you say? Second law of thermodynamics says that energy cannot organize itself or wind itself up by natural means. And yet the entire universe is full of organized energy. How did it get wound up? How did it get organized in the first place? The second law of thermodynamics says it didn't happen by itself. If it didn't happen naturally, it must have happened supernaturally. Well, you just rehearse that a few times in your mind and get it down, and now you're ready to present that as a case for there has to be a supernatural explanation for the origin of the universe. Now, someone might come up, as one guy did in a debate, or during a debate Q&A, came up to the microphone there, and it was my turn to answer the question. He says, well, you haven't dealt with which God and life itself. And I said, well, we're not debating those points. See, you got to keep your argument straight, right? Because what was he doing? That's called, in philosophy and debate, that's called moving the goalpost. Moving the goalpost. And they do that, and that keeps you running, and they're just slipping away. So you want to lock in and say, have we settled this point yet? Yes, do we both agree now? Yes, okay. So the evidence for the supernatural origin of life has its own set of questions and evidences that are different than the origin of the universe. Now this begins with the law of biogenesis. And I'm going to make a point here that I don't know if any of you have come across yet, but there has been an attempt, and it's been for about 10 years or more now, that there is a redefining of what this law is, the law of biogenesis. They're trying to use this law or apply this name to Ernst Haeckel's ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Did you get that one? Yeah. Well, that was Ernst Haeckel, who was, and I'll talk more about him tomorrow night, but that's where he fabricated the speciation of, or the evolutionary evidence for embryology of organisms going through all the different stages of evolution. So the human embryo starts out and it looks like a little cell, a single-celled amoeba, and then it looks like a fish, and then it looks like a lizard, and then it looks like a bird, and then it looks like... Anyway, they go through all the stages of evolution. So it's recapitulating or repeating phylogeny, which is evolution. And that's where that phrase comes from. The ontogeny, which is the embryological development, repeats or recapitulates phylogeny. Anyway, you might want to learn that term. That's so much fun to say. Now, this law is being associated with that scandal. It's a science scandal. And he was tried in court in the Jena University court and found guilty 5 counts of fraud for his work. And so the evolutionists are trying to say the law of biogenesis refers to that. No, that's not. Here's the law of biogenesis states that all living cells come from pre-existing cells. Now you might think, oh, okay, he's got a picture of a biology book, but that book is very significant. This is the book I used to teach biology labs at the University of Arkansas. I used this book. It was a mainstay. It was a part of the University of Arkansas's biology program for many years. And this is written by Helena Curtis. And on page 90 in the second edition, which this book we were using, this law of biogenesis is stated: where a cell exists, there must have been a pre-existing cell, just as the animal arises from an animal and the plant only from a plant. And that sounds shocking now when you realize what public schools are actually teaching. But see, this is the law of biogenesis. I put that book up there, and I've got the quote, and I have the book on my shelf at home because that book has disappeared at the University of Arkansas. It occurred during a seminar, and I told the story last night about Dr. Kramer challenging me, and I said, well, Dr. Kramer, I'm using the definition out of the book you approved. You sat on the book committee, and that book disappeared from that point on. They even removed it from the shelves in the library, in the university library, censoring the information so students won't know that. Oh, that's really despicable, isn't it? But that's the sort of tactics that are going on and being used. But that is the law of biogenesis, that every living cell comes from a pre-existing living cell, which then raises the interesting question, right? Where'd the first cell come from? If all cells come from pre-existing cells, life does not come from lifeless molecules. Okay, well, that's what the law is. Hey, by the way, and this guy, Louis Pasteur, came up with an interesting experiment, the swan neck experiment, in which he demonstrated and allowed air the vitalism that the spontaneous generation, or the evolutionists of his day, said had to be there. He created this swan neck flask, and he boiled the mix of broth there in the flask, and then he let it sit there, and nothing grew. And then he tilted it, and the broth touched some of the contamination, came up to the end point of the tube, and then he brought it back down, and it was contaminated. He demonstrated with that experiment that the germs floating around the air is what was giving rise to what others were saying, life is growing out of this, out of nothing, out of this broth, out of this food stuff. It just spontaneously generates itself. Louis Pasteur's experiment put spontaneous generation in its coffin, put the nails in it. And when I say put the nails in it, they just revived and got a little more sophisticated in their explanations. But there are no known exceptions to this. Every time you open up a can of beef soup or peanut butter, you ever look for things growing in it? Well, you should. Yeah, I had a can of vegetable beef that blew up on my shelf. That happens because if a can drops, someone pulls it off the shelf, drops it on the floor, and that vacuum seal breaks and sucks up a spore or something. They get in there, start fermenting, and they start puffing up the can, and that's why you have this can. They say, make sure those cans aren't bowed on top, right? Well, that's important to do. But they came from the floor, from the environment. They didn't come out of the soup. Now, if all cells come from pre-existing living cells, then where did the first cell come from? Well, here's what we know. Cells cannot naturally produce themselves from lifeless molecules. Therefore, the first living cell must have come into being by supernatural means. Didn't happen naturally. It had to be supernatural. Guess what? The creation science model has yet another law on its side. The creation science model conforms perfectly to 3 foundational laws of science. Doesn't that just make you feel good? It makes you want to go out there and share that with someone. You can't lose this debate. It's impossible because you've got the laws of science on your side. To propose that life, cells, came out of lifeless molecules is to contradict the law of biogenesis. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not trying, because laws are meant to be broken, right? And so scientists are always trying to disprove and show, no, it can really happen. Well, they haven't yet. I like to tell this story about the Origin of Life prize. $1 million to anyone who can demonstrate the plausibility. You don't even have to create life in the laboratory. They'll give you $1 million if you just show the plausibility that life can come from lifeless molecules. You know what that word plausibility means? You know what it's implying? Everything that they have to say about it right now is implausible, irrational, doesn't work, doesn't make sense. They will give you $1 million if you just say something that makes sense. Well, not anymore. That was going on for over 10 years, and anyway, no one claimed it. No one came up with anything, so they ended that in 2013. Now, Jack Szostak from Harvard University in 1992 made the papers. He made our paper in Fayetteville anyway. It was sort of buried. It was a buried article towards the back. But I saw life created in the laboratory. That's the way the heading was. Life created in the laboratory. I said, whoa, I needed to look into that. So I'm reading the article and finding out that, yeah, he hadn't yet, but by the end of the year, he said 1992, by the end of 1992, was just a few months away, he was going to have life created in his laboratory. And that he had knocked off 7 steps and he only had 2 more to go or something like that. So, has anybody ever heard of Jack Szostak? That's because it didn't. He would have been world famous, but he's not because he failed to do that. However, he did say, technically, he did create life in the laboratory, so I was reading the fine print. You know, you always have to read through, what is he really saying? In spite of what the headlines say, life is created in the laboratory. Well, they only use that because he said that he created life in the laboratory, but when you read the article, he was redefining life. And here's what he said. He created life in the laboratory because he had a special collection of proteins, and he had micelles formed, which are lipids that sort of form like bubbles. So you got the bubbles, and some of those proteins filtered in through the bubbles, inside the bubbles, and you had all the makeup for life, and they divided. That's interesting. They divided. I was reading further, and the way he was dividing them, the way the cells were dividing is he was shaking the bubbles, and the bubbles were splitting. And I told my wife, hey, You know what? You're creating life in the kitchen sink every night. Every night. You got these bubbles and you got all the scrapings of food in there and they're in the bubbles, and every time you bust up the bubbles and you're splitting them, you're creating life in the kitchen. Now that's just absurd. But see, that's redefine. See, they'll go to any extent. He was redefining life, and then what did the news editor title the article to be? Life created in the laboratory. If you're not reading it, you wouldn't know how ridiculous it was. And of course, no one's ever heard of Jack Szostak. Now, as of July 16, 2019, a engineer and entrepreneur, Perry Marshall, is now offering $10 million for a patentable process that will, and the way he describes it, will produce a self-organizing digital communication system. And he's trying to redefine all this and take it out of chemistry and make it more information focused. And he said that's really at the heart of this whole question, and being a electrical engineer and having knowledge of computers, he's showing that computer information and DNA information really line up and look very parallel. They're very similar. That this is the crux of the question that has to be addressed, and if it does get addressed, and someone can actually demonstrate how information can originate by itself, the DNA molecule, how it can come about, and how that translation process, translating the DNA into meaningful proteins, how those two questions can be answered. He said that's going to be earth-shattering. History will be made. Well, I agree, it will be, if it ever happens. All right, so anyway, I'm just showing you there's all kinds of incentives. So if you want to get your $10 million, it's out there for you. So the law of biogenesis states that the foundation, this foundation, or I should say the Origin of Life Foundation, is trying to buck against the system, trying to motivate people to show that the origin of life, the law of biogenesis, is in fact not a law, but it can be overcome. And so here they're saying, hey, the foundation wishes to encourage the pursuit of natural process explanations and mechanisms. But wait, that contradicts the law of thermodynamics. How did so many biochemical pathways get integrated into one coherent, unified, and sophisticated metabolic process? When you start looking at all the inner workings that it takes to make a living cell, there's nothing simple about it. It's extremely complex. Just the DNA molecule itself is extremely complex. So how can we simplify that for ourselves? So everyone here, all ages, can go out there and share that with someone. Well, you just say, law of biogenesis. Well, they'll say, what? What's that? Well, that says all living cells come from a pre-existing cell. Okay, so what does that mean for God? Well, it means that living cells had to come from another living cell. It can't come from lifeless molecules, so where did the first cell come from? It had to be supernatural. Yep, had to be supernatural. Now you got 3 laws to present to your friends and whoever you're talking to. And it's not that difficult, is it? Just learn those laws and see where the conclusion leads. Evolution, on the other hand, is proposing only natural explanations, which means it's contradicting known scientific laws, and models that contradict laws of science are clearly unscientific. Now, just a couple of quotes here for you. Jay Sullivan writes, "The beginning of the evolutionary process raises a question which is, as of yet, unanswerable. And that's unanswerable even today. What was the origin of life on this planet? Until fairly recent times, there was a pretty general belief in the occurrence of spontaneous generation. Back to Louis Pasteur's day. It was supposed that lowly forms of life developed spontaneously from, for example, putrefying meat. But careful experiments, notably those of Pasteur, showed that this conclusion was due to imperfect observation, and it became an accepted doctrine, that is, the law of biogenesis, that life never arises except from life. So far as actual evidence goes, this is still the only possible conclusion. But, listen to this, but since it is the conclusion that seems to lead back to some supernatural creative event, it's a conclusion that scientific men find very difficult of acceptance. Even with the evidence, irrefutable laws established because of the evidence, it's still being rejected. That's not science. And there is no reason to kick creation science presentations out of the universities or out of our high schools. Now, we know that, we can see that, but in Arkansas, in 1981, we had the Balanced Equal Treatment Act, and that's where, for whatever time you give to evolution, you're supposed to give equal time to creation. And Judge Overton ruled, even after all the scientists went up and gave their testimony, creationists and evolutionists, but the creationists had given scientific evidence for the creation model, and Judge Overton wrote with a single sentence, he said, "Creationism is religion, and therefore it has no business in the science classroom." Oh, that sounds familiar. And so he dismissed the case. And he ruled that the law was unconstitutional. Violation of church and state is what he said, because of that single statement. Anyway, I hope that you feel better equipped now. You got origin of the universe arguments, you got origin of life arguments, and tomorrow we'll talk about speciation. All right?